So Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about something that's not cycling related and not archery related either. This is a totally new thing, and that's Hema, or Historical European Martial Arts. Now, this might seem strange as somebody who's never done any contact sports, not even as a kid. I never played lacrosse or hockey or football. Why would I be interested in anything that contains the term martial arts? Well, because historical European martial arts encompasses various fighting skills and techniques that were used throughout history in Europe. And one of the big ones is the sword. Now, it's not exclusively sword fighting. There's dagger fighting, staff fighting, pole arms, unarmed fighting, etc. But when most people who aren't Hema experts think of Hema, what they usually think of is swords. And that's kind of how I wanted to get into it and why I wanted to get into it. And, I've always been interested in history and I've always been interested in weapons. And the idea of learning how to fight with a sword, it obviously is something that in modern times is anachronistic, but if you're interested in history and you're interested in weapons, then why not also learn more about those things? And so I've attended two Hema courses now at the local Hema club here in New Jersey. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about Hema and a little bit about why I decided to get into it. So here we go. This is my long sword. As you can tell, it is, in fact, plenty long. Although this is actually spring steel, but it's actually a little bit shorter and smaller in proportion compared to most sparring longswords or most blunt longswords. Most of the swords you're going to use to practice in Hema if you're practicing longsword, and longsword is one of the most popular categories of weapon in Hema because it's something, well, there's a variety of reasons. I think it's a combination of the fact that there's a lot of historical treatises about longsword, but also the fact that the longsword is a very impressive weapon, and that it's a very iconic weapon. It's associated with, knights and chivalry and all of that stuff. But also for beginners who aren't used to this kind of activity, it can be easier to use. I got to be careful here because of the lamp and all the other things, but it's a lot of times easier to use a two-handed sword than a one-handed sword because your two hands are splitting the work. So a lot of times, and I've tried using one-handed swords in the past, and what I found is that your arm gets tired real quick, whereas two-handed swords, not so much. So I think that's one of the reasons for their popularity. But anyway, the longsword is one of the most popular Hema weapons, as it were. But most of the longswords that people spar with or practice with or train with are based on what's called Fetishwork or feather swords in German. And these are weapons that have a thin blade, often thinner than this in terms of width, and then a thick section down by what would normally be the blunted ricasso, where it sort of flares out a little bit on the sides. And those are called schilts. Now, people have joked that this stands for shitty hilt, but the reality is the schilt is basically like a extra shield or extra, like a pre-crossguard crossguard. So if you could picture, if you had little metal ears projecting on the side here, and a blade came down, it would catch on those before it got to your crossguard. That's kind of what the schilt does. And many of these swords also have longer grips, in some cases several inches longer, maybe a whole hand's width longer, as well as somewhat longer blades. So this one's a little bit shorter in the blade, and it's a little bit shorter in the handle. Now, it's worth noting that this was actually made by one of the people at the at the local Hema club. Uh, I think he used an existing crossguard and pommel, but the blade was basically made out of spring steel that he had lying around. And it is blunted. There's no edge. There's no sharp tip. But in proportions, it's more like a regular sword than a Fetishwork. And it's worth noting that a lot of the Fetishworks have really long handles and really long blades compared to known historical examples of actual longswords. So for somebody who's just getting into this and isn't incredibly big, I'm only 5'8", this was more to my proportions. So even if I do get a proper Fetishwork at some point in the future that has the hilt and the narrower blade and all that, I probably will get one that has a handle length similar to this, perhaps no longer, and a blade that isn't much longer either. So now it's worth noting that when you're sparring, you're wearing protective gear, including a face mask, back of the head protection, gloves, and usually some kind of padded fencing jacket and even a gorget around the neck if you're using steel. With synthetic swords, you can usually get away with just gloves and a fencing mask. I'll get to that in a second. Of course, when you're wearing gloves, it might behoove you to have a longer hilt because your hands are going to be effectively bigger since you're wearing gloves around them. So I understand why some of the fetters are larger. That said, this feels more like a real sword, as it were. Anyway, there's a whole big discussion about the difference between blunts or sword-like sparring swords versus actual Fetishworks. I'm not going to get into that. As a noob, I'm probably not qualified to get into that in terms of knowledge base, but these are just my initial impressions. Now, what will happen at your first Hema outing? A lot of the clubs will give you an introductory lesson or several. In the case of my local Hema club, NJ-HFA, New Jersey Historical Fencing Association, they'll give you 4 free lessons, and you can borrow equipment, which will include a sword, nylon, steel, whatever, and protective gear. Now, most of the time, this was a personal weapon belonging to a fellow club member that I actually got off him, and now it belongs to me. But generally speaking, the club will usually have loaner weapons, but often for the novices, you're going to be sparring with nylon swords. They might let you handle the steel swords the first time and swing them around, and that's all great. But generally speaking, for the novices, the first time out, you're going to get a nylon sword. And the reason for having a synthetic rather than a steel sword is that the blades are thicker, so if you do get hit, the force is spread over a wider area. Because of this, you don't need as much protective gear. For nylon swords, thick padded gloves and a fencing mask with back of the head protection is usually sufficient. That's what I've been doing. I've been borrowing the fencing mask, borrowing the gloves, which essentially are lacrosse gloves, and using the nylon sword in sparring. But for solo practice and for some drills, with the blade-on-blade contact, I had used this. And of course, now that it's mine, I can practice with it at home as well. Since I don't own a gambeson or a padded fencing jacket, or gloves or gauntlets or a mask or anything else, I'm probably not going to be able to use this to spar at full speed with anybody else with a steel sword until I get those things. However, I could certainly practice with this in the interim on my own, etc. And certainly I could do slow speed drills with it and so forth. Now, most of the times when you go to one of these things, the people are very helpful. I mean, Hema is not a giant, huge. It is kind of more or less worldwide. I mean, they've got tournaments and fencing clubs everywhere, Canada, England, America, etc. But the truth is that it's not something ginormous that everybody knows about, like baseball or football or soccer. So a lot of times the people are interested in growing the activity, growing the sport. If you show up at one of these things and you have questions about the equipment, the techniques, the gear, the fencing manuals, people are very helpful. They will talk to you. They will try to help you learn, and they want you to get into it because they want the sport to grow. Uh, it's kind of like cyclists. I mean, I've been a bicyclist for many years, and not only myself but any other cyclist I know, if somebody stops them on the street and asks them about their bike or their equipment, they'll talk your ear off. Not just because it's something that they care about and they're interested in, but because they understand that if you really are interested in it yourself and they can impart some knowledge to get you started, then appreciation for that activity will grow. So uh, it's a very helpful, it's a very welcoming atmosphere, at least in my limited experience. But I can only assume that many of the fencing clubs the world over are similar to mine. Uh, Now, how is it for somebody in a modern Western society who's not used to contact sports? I'm going to be blunt. It's a little scary at first. Um, we could start with the fact that, like many of these activities, and I've even gone to bike rides when you have to do this, they usually make you sign some kind of a paper that says if I get hurt, I won't sue. I understand why that is, and I'm totally cool with that. I had to do that last time I did the 5 borough bike ride in New York. I had to do that when I did the Covered Bridges Metric Century in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Basically, any kind of an organized event that has some aspect of athleticism, they're going to want you to sign a thing that says you won't sue them if you bust your face or whatever. I get it. That said, as for somebody who's never really fought with swords outside of sticks and stuff when you were a kid, you're looking at this and you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of scary that I have to sign that. But you sign it and you move on. What happens next? Well, you get your borrowed gear. And again, it's most likely going to be repurposed gloves from another sport and a 3 weapons fencing mask that is designed for foil, epee, and saber with some kind of back of the head protection. This could be professionally manufactured or improvised or both, depending. Um, and usually that's sufficient for the nylon sparring swords. Now, some of the guys there did have the Rawlings line of sparring swords, but I'm going to be honest, they never used them. What they were using were the synthetic long swords from the Purple Heart Armory, and that's actually based here in the U.S. apparently. And these apparently aren't as floppy; they're a little stiffer, so they're a little more realistic. And they had several. Some of them were really old and nicked up. Some of them were newer. Some of them had pommels like this, where it kind of looks like the finial you'd have on the end of a lamp. What's been called a scent stopper style pommel. I think that's the word. Others had the round wheel pommels. Some had shorter handles, some had longer handles. The ones with the wheel pommels tended to handle more like a real sword rather than a plastic stick. They were a little lighter and a little more nimble and a little more well balanced. And aesthetically, I like the look of the round pommels. I thought they were pretty cool. But they were still plastic swords, essentially. That said, you get to practice with them, and you get to learn a thing or two. You may spar on your first time, depending on how the club's set up. You may just do drills. You may be doing drills in conjunction with a partner, or you may just be following the motions of the instructor and learning from him, and everybody kind of doing the same thing. It really depends on the situation and on the club, but they're not going to throw you right into a pitched battle. This isn't like Gladiator. They're not going to give you a sword and say, here, go wallop the other guy, without showing you what to do, how to do it properly, and how you won't get hurt. And most people are cognizant of the fact that when you're swinging swords or sword replicas at each other or sword substitutes, that there's a potential for injury. And there's a whole industry that's going up around this, providing fencing jackets, masks, gloves, etc. It's still kind of developing as the sport grows, but or activity or historical interest, if the term sport offends you. But there are companies out there making everything from full-on gauntlets to plastic or synthetic armored gauntlets to individual fingered gloves, and so on and so forth. And you'll find a wide variety. A lot of times it's personal preference. I had a couple of the guys flat out tell me that, they really want to make sure their hands don't get broken, and so that's their main concern. I had other people tell me flat out that they were willing to risk a lesser degree of protection for greater mobility and using the weapon and able to do the techniques better with less interference from the protective gear. And as a cyclist, I know obviously that's a trade-off you always get. I mean, you know, protection versus mobility. I mean, look at mountain bikers who wear shin guards, or the issue of helmets and vents and so forth. Um, Obviously, it's something that's more of an issue when, I mean, the whole point of this is to be able to manipulate the sword. I don't want to hit the ceiling there. It's kind of hard to manipulate the sword if you can't manipulate the sword. So, and there's, in a strange way, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You wear more protective gear so that you can be more protected in case you get hit. But if it slows you down and makes you cumbersome, you're more likely to get hit, especially since longsword is a single weapon. It's not a paired weapon like sword and buckler, where you have a shorter one-handed sword and a shield, a small shield, or like a rapier and dagger, where you have a rapier and then a parrying dagger. Longsword is one weapon against one weapon. So your sword is not only your means of attack, it's also your means of defense. So paradoxically, the very things you wear to protect yourself against a strike, should you fail in your defense and get hit, might make that defense more likely to fail because they impede your movement. And I've seen various types of gauntlets and gloves. I'm still a little too new at this to decide, what I would want. I'm not going to just drop, like $2 on a pair of gloves that turns out to be shit for me. But and it's worth noting that a lot of times the fact that a pair of gloves or gauntlets may not work for an individual swordsman or swordswoman, as the case may be, doesn't mean that they're a bad design or that they're shit per se. It just may mean they may be shit for that person because of sizing issues, the size of their hands, the way they move, the length of the grip on their particular choice of sword, etc. So, there are some people who, for them, a particular glove may work excellent, and for other people, it may be uncomfortable or cumbersome or whatever. So, I haven't bought my own set of gloves precisely because I don't have the requisite experience at this point in time to assess what I should be using. It's kind of like cleats. When you get into cycling and you decide you want to use clipless pedals on a particular bike, do you just run out and buy whatever's on sale? I mean, how do you know whether do you want to use Look brand cleats, Shimano SPDs, those little frog pedals, whatever. You kind of need to know what you're going to be using before you go out and buy pedals and shoes and cleats and all the other stuff. Same thing with this. So I got my sword from my one of the fellow fencers, but I haven't yet got gloves or even a face mask. And I'm going to be honest, I've been haunting the Craigslist looking at fencing masks, and I have a big head. There's only one fencing mask in the loaner pile that actually fits me fully, and it fits a little tight. I'm not going to buy something sight unseen off Craigslist. For all I know, it might be an extra small. And people aren't always great at listing proportions and measurements. I mean, I've sold bike frames and bike parts on Craigslist and eBay where I listed everything from the type of threading of the bottom bracket shell to the seat height, the top tube length, the frame angles, what material it's made out of, the interior diameter of the seat tube. This takes a 27.2 millimeter seat post, etc. A lot of guys don't bother with that shit when they're trying to sell used stuff. I might put up there, that it's a it's a 52 centimeter frame, measured center to center. It has English threading on the bottom bracket shell. The rear wheel spacing is 126 millimeters, and it takes a 26.4 seat interior diameter seat post. Somebody else might just put blue bike for sale. And if you want to find anything out, you got to email them and pester them for measurements, which they probably don't have on hand because they haven't bothered to do them. So yeah, I haven't bought. I've been looking at fencing masks. I haven't bought anything. Um, but I do have my sword, so I can practice now. And this is definitely something that I intend to stick with. I am. Oh, there's a little nick here. I gotta clean that up with a file. This is definitely something that I intend to stick with. It's something that I've always kind of wanted to do, ever since I was a kid, and I spent like, one month just reading through the book, The Archaeology of Weapons, which was about swords and stuff. And I've always been into this type of thing. And it's nice to actually, learn how to use the swords and handle them. And it's, so sort of a foregone conclusion that if the opportunity presented itself, this is something that I would definitely want to learn. But I think there's also an aspect to it of being able to handle yourself physically. I mean, let's face it, this modern, cubicle office world that a lot of us live in or stuck in, unless you did contact sports as a kid or as an adult, there's really not a lot of chances you get to say, could I handle myself theoretically in a fight? Now, that's not to say that I want to go out looking for a fight. I'm a nonviolent person. I don't want to hurt anybody. I do think that, by the way, there's a bias against weapons or people who are interested in weapons-related activities, whether it's archery, shooting firearms, fencing, or even traditional, Japanese, like kenjutsu or something. Which is strange because for over 2,000 years of human history, and even back into prehistory, weapon skills were essential life skills. I get it. Now we have a police and an army and all that stuff. But the point is, as a human being, it's sort of still nice to know that you can take care of yourself, even if it's in a sporting context. And this is something that life doesn't usually give us a chance to determine. So, as somebody, I mean, I shoot a bow, I ride a bike. I'm fairly confident if, God forbid, something was to go sideways with society tomorrow, would I still be able to, shoot food? Probably. Would I still be able to get around? Probably. But nothing I've ever done has involved hand-to-hand confrontation. This does, and this offers me the opportunity to say, well, okay, now I know that I might be able to handle that type of a thing. Even if it's in a sort of stylized sporting context. But I think that kind of physical confidence is something that's important for you to have as an individual, who is ultimately, of course, responsible for their own life, rightly or wrongly. I also think that it's good exercise, and I'm going to be brutally honest. I bike, but aside from shooting my bow, I don't really do anything else athletic. I would not go to a gym on a regular basis. Yes, I could go to like the Y. It's just down the street from my house. It's actually within walking distance. But I know that if I went and I got a membership there, I wouldn't stick with it because going to a gym is fucking boring. Excuse my French. Going to a gym, however, where you fight with long swords, that's pretty damn cool. So there's another aspect to it, which is that it gets you moving, it gets you exercising your whole body, more ways than in some way you often do with cycling. And there's that. So, this is something I intend to stick with. It's something I intend to keep doing. And, hopefully I'll be able to talk more about it when I've learned more. But anyway, that's historical fencing, or Hema as it's called. And Lone Rider, out.